Welcome to the I Am CandidateX series, the show about community, innovators, entrepreneurs, and the impact they are having in our world, all through a diversity and inclusion lens. I'm your host, Man Wong, and today I'm joined by Christine Hemphill. Christine is the founder and managing director of Open Inclusion. Founded in 2015, Open Inclusion is an accessibility and innovation consultancy. Partnering clients to understand inclusion opportunities and issues, Open Inclusion helps create products, services, and environments that are not only beautiful, but inclusive and effective for everyone. Christine, a very warm welcome to you on a very rainy day in London. How are you, and where are you speaking to us from today?
Hi, man. Lovely to speak to you today. Yes, our rain's moved on here. We've just got grey clouds today, but I'm speaking to you from France today. Actually, my home base is here in the French Alps, although Open is a London-based organisation. So usually I'm flitting to and from the two of them quite regularly. At the moment, obviously not so much.
You've been there since lockdown, huh?
We have, yes. Yeah.
At least you've got the open space to sort of enjoy, which is great.
Thankfully.
Been taking advantage of that, I hope.
We have, yes. No, especially, in fact, it was almost like from the beginning of lockdown, spring started. So we had the most remarkable 6 weeks when, no one was really meant to be going out at all, where it was beautiful sunshine all the time. But luckily, we're right on a hill, so you don't have any problems with social distancing.
Oh, brilliant. And your family must be, are you enjoying the enforced family time with each other, I guess, during this period? Is it more on time with each other than you've ever experienced in the period?
It's really interesting. In our household, we've had one period from 2010 to 2000, kind of mid-2011. Other than that, the last 2 decades, either my husband and or I have been traveling all the time for work.
Wow.
Regularly, pretty well every week, and it's been an absolute delight to have a couple of months with zero travel required and all of us in the home all the time. So yes, teenagers in the home all the time, occasionally it gets a little challenging, but actually it's been a real, we've got to recognize this is a privilege for us, and it's not been a pleasure for everyone. But just having that time where you're all together, there's not the distractions of so much schooling or so much activity for the boys. It's been really nice.
It's interesting, isn't it? And it's been one of the more stressful periods, certainly in my life, for a number of reasons, because of this enforced lockdown. But I have to say, I don't think I've laughed as much because I'm with the family, and all that sort of stuff. And just as you say, having that privilege to see them grow so closely, which I otherwise I'd be stuck behind a desk, probably in meetings and all that sort of stuff, having them in care with someone else and picking them up. Don't get me wrong, it can be very stressful, but at the same token, the yin and the yang, I guess, let's just say. Really.
Taking the benefits that have come with this, it's a very high cost to society and to individuals, to all of us in different ways. But it has landed very unevenly, but there is also some very nice things that have landed with it. A bit like you, we've got kids that aren't going to be with us that much longer. Our oldest son will, probably go off to university this time next year. So, take that time while we've got it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before we get into the crux of the conversation, what have you missed in normal life, quote unquote, during this lockdown period?
Hanging out with girlfriends in probably, when I go to London, I catch up with, friends there, and we'll go out for a drink in the evening, or that physical face-to-face with people. I miss that. Lots of engagement happening and lots of communication, and I haven't felt that I've missed that. But there is that kind of catching up with friends, particularly whether it's friends here or friends there. And actually the unexpected catch-ups with people. Everything is planned in lockdown. So you can catch up with fabulous people and reach out to people, and people will reach out. But those unplanned conversations that just happen when you're at a meetup or at an event or going and visiting a client and you meet up with someone there, that doesn't happen at the moment. And I miss that. I like that, the surprises of the day.
100%. The spontaneity of life is what we're all missing, I think, during this period. So fingers crossed, not too long before it can sort of revert back to some of that aspect, and we can all look forward to that. Well, I want to say a big thanks for your time today, for joining us and having a conversation. Dying to find out a bit more about yourself, what you've been doing, and a lot more about your business. So before we get into open inclusion, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, I wanted to start with the conversation around your earlier career, because you've not always been in inclusion or diversity and inclusion in that space, and research and design. You started your career a little bit earlier in some different guises. Can you talk us a little bit through that?
Yes, I've had a very mixed career, and I do feel like one of the newbies into this space. So I still wear my, I still ask all the curious and weird questions of someone who's quite new to it, which sometimes is a real advantage and sometimes not. I started actually in mining, of all places. In fact, we were just talking before about my very first career was in Hong Kong and Beijing, and got sent up to North Asia, for a mining organisation that had picked me up and paid my way through university. And that was a fabulous and interesting career because, yes, I was one of the few women involved in it. It was very long relationships with organisations, so you were really just the mantle holder for a short period in a very long time. Some of the relationships between organisations, our organisation and a client, might already be 50 years old. So that made for a very interesting, if you think about game theory, that kind of repeated game that every year you'd have negotiations with different people but same organisations, so that you very much had to respect that long game attitude to life. And it was a tiny community, funnily enough. Although it's a very big industry, it's a very small group of people globally that are involved in sales and purchasing for minerals and metals.
Wow.
So that was interesting, very physical products. So, very much the engineering type products. So my first, innovation projects were in engineering spaces. So, you could see it and you could measure it and you could test it in a very physical way, which is quite interesting now when I think about designing services that are really very intangible, and then we're doing research to test them.
Yeah,
which is not nearly so
polar opposites almost, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very different move. But that was the early career. I then went into consulting because I loved the change. I loved the innovation side of it. So I kind of followed some of the consulting houses I'd worked with into management consulting, and then from there into banking. Actually, mainly because I'd travelled so much. I love travel, but we were looking to have a family, and there's something about very young families travelling all the time doesn't work so well. So I went to an industry where they needing a lot of innovation knowledge. They were needing people that understood customers better because they weren't brilliant at understanding their customer base. Banks were kind of quite good at pushing product as opposed to understanding desire and demand. And that was a very interesting early 2000s, so early days of digital. So real transformation in the way in which services and products were being created and provided.
Okay.
And really quite fast changes. Well, fast changes for a very slow moving industry in terms of customer expectations of what's possible. So if you think about the beginning of that decade, people didn't do online banking. By the end of the decade, particularly in Australia, where I was at the time, online banking had become very, very, it had a huge take up and was the preferred option for many people, certainly for retail banking. So it was this really interesting transformative period to be, and of course, through the financial crisis, nothing like working in a bank through a financial crisis, to learn and to see what works and what doesn't, culturally or product-wise or consumer-wise. So that was a really interesting period. And then I came to inclusion through design, so through that innovation and design bent. And when I started working in Europe in 2013, really kind of differentiated a digital design agency. We were working, I was building at the time for someone else, not my organisation, but we differentiated that on the basis of inclusion and accessibility. And that was such a positive experience. And I saw the potential of inclusive design to differentiate product and service outcomes from the customer perspective so effectively. And yet few people, it seemed to still be this niche thing that you added on after, as opposed to just a way to make much better product that, yes, supports some people all of the time that otherwise would be excluded, but also just has this lovely positive flow-on effect to your mainstream customer base that just makes better product.
Interesting, isn't it? It's rather than thinking of it after the event as a bolt-on, begin with it at the core and design it from there. It's always in focus, always in mind, so that it enables that accessibility and that inclusive mindset from the beginning. Just quickly back to your early career. I feel like you've missed a big portion about it through your sports there, and that I can't move on from that point without really sort of talking about it. So I need you to park your humility and let me have some of the accomplishments that you've achieved there.
Yeah, I took a little segue slightly late in life, but actually it had an inclusive driver. So my sister we've both got two sons. Her second son was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy when he was 4. It was just this very challenging year that followed of learning about it before the changes had really hit so fully for him, because it's a progressive condition.
Wow.
But just that knowledge and that recognition of life is going to be different to what we potentially perceived, and understanding that difference and understanding what that meant. So I went and did a triathlon for charity to raise some money for the research foundation, simply to put myself through some pain, to show my sister I was on the dirty with her. Couldn't take it away, couldn't change what it was, just wanted to show that I gave a damn. And that opened a door that became an interesting and unusual adventure, a fabulous adventure actually, where that race that I did for charity happened to be a qualification race for the World Champs. I actually didn't know that at the time.
I was about to ask you, so you didn't know that at the time?
No.
Incredible.
And I ended up qualifying, and the World Champs that year happened to be in Australia, so I decided to take it up. And then found a coach, got myself to it actually in better shape than I was, at the beginning, because obviously I still had an 18-month-old son at the beginning of this, so I was still kind of getting my fitness back.
My gosh.
After having children. And by the time I went to the World Champs, I was actually moving quite a lot faster and getting more competitive. And my coach just went to me, drop your day job. I was still working, at the bank. Drop your day job for a while. Come and give this thing a go. I think you might have a chance. And so the next World Championships, both short and long course, or Olympic distance and ITU long course, were in Europe. His girlfriend was based in Europe, so he said, come over to Europe, spend a year, train here, and see where you go. And that was a good year. So I ended up racing professionally for 3 years after that, and moved out of amateur after that first year, and that brought us to Europe.
I love how you were just going to bypass that whole portion of your life. There's no way I was going to let you do that. I mean, I would call myself, and I'd be very generous by saying I'm a keen cyclist. So, I'm always enamored by people who compete in this professionally, incredible. So, and I think it gives you certainly it helps me understand a little bit more about your why, as to how you got into this with a lot of vigor, really, because it's very personal, and with what happened with your sister and I guess with your nephew in terms of that diagnosis. So is that the first couple steps in line with also the product piece that you were doing in your other day job, with regards to, okay, there's a big opportunity here with looking at making things inclusive and making things as accessible as possible? Is that what sort of drove you?
It's really interesting. It's one of those things that I wish I could know how to do this better, to share this passion, because once you've seen exclusion, and once you've seen the pain and the frustration of exclusion, and then from the other side, that which was what kind of happened on the personal journey, and with the other side, once you've seen the power of design and innovation to solve problems, human problems, in meaningful ways, it's so hard not to put these things together. It's so hard to ever unsee that, and it's so hard to ever want to design anything that's going to give people a bad experience, when simply by using good human-centered design and inclusively, specifically inclusive human-centered design, we cannot do that. So it's one of those things where it was this combination of a personal journey and a professional journey that made it so obvious to me, and yet there wasn't momentum in this space. There are lots of great organisations that have been working in this space for years, but what I saw was advocacy organisations that came very much from that personal perspective, and here's what our community are feeling and receiving, and this is why you should change it. And then there were some design organisations that had some elements of good inclusive design, but not necessarily full spectrum. And that very positive and innovation first, how do we solve for this better, for more people, so that it's a better experience more consistently, And also, I think, just one other element, I suppose, the third pillar of that is probably the fact that I'm an economist by trade. And don't hold it against me, but actually,
I'm a recruiter by trade, so don't worry.
Well, there you go. But I also look at the commercial aspect of this, and let's not look at that, because this is the largest global underserved market, people with varying abilities. That how can we not look at that and go, this is an opportunity? So a lot of it had been stick-based up until then. There's a little bit of innovation in spaces that have come through very strongly, but that insight-led, exclusion, identification and removal, there wasn't a lot of organisations or a lot of capability that seemed to be sitting in the market doing that. And particularly with good research at its heart. I'm a believer in, no one person can understand the lived experience of the community of people you're wanting to service with a product or a service, either commercially or as a government organisation or what have you. So we need to put research at the heart of it, and we need to ask people about their experience, because we can't just empathise to understand. We have to actually find out what that experience is like, because people are fabulously diverse in the way that they adapt to differences. So even three people with the same physical condition, they might have the same level of sight loss or the same level of mobility restriction, but they'll adapt to that in completely differentiated ways based on where they live, the challenges and hurdles that would have otherwise got in their day, what their preferences are, whether they, so all of these things then become things we need to ask. So putting research at the heart of what we do allows us to solve in a much, much more powerful way and effectively.
So did you find that, given the things that you saw, obviously being an economist by heart, by trade, you could see the tremendous opportunity. Would it be a fair comment to say that you were an accidental entrepreneur in starting Open?
I would say I was an accidental finder of inclusive design and innovation as a capability and as a thing that really just sits perfectly with me in the design agency I worked with before, because we chose to differentiate it with accessibility at the heart. We went looking for specific people, people that had great capability, and that brought them in-house. I started to learn and get on that journey with them. By the time I set up Open, I knew this was my thing. It's one of those things. It was a bit like when I got to triathlon. I had been doing triathlon for 9 months. I did a bit when I was at university, but I'd competed in triathlon as an adult, post-university, for 9 months by the time I went to the first World Champs I went to. And by the time I went there, it was my thing. I managed to finish on the podium in my age group 9 months into doing this sport. I didn't need long to know that fit was right. It's the same with inclusive design and innovation for me. After the agency experience was accidental, and partly accidental, partly just bringing together things that seemed quite logical to me as a differentiator, and then falling into it, learning more, and just going, this fits perfectly. And it seems to fit a need that's out there and unmet quite perfectly. I really enjoy this space, and that's what triggered us to go and set up Open.
Magic. So in 2015, just before that happened and the stars were aligning for you as such, what was the mission that you wanted to achieve with Open?
Really good question. Probably three things. Firstly, I wanted inclusion to be positive, not negative. So a lot of accessibility, particularly that kind of just making it accessible to standards so that there's compliance tick box exercise, was all about mitigating risk and managing the downside. I saw inclusion as this very, very powerful upside driver, and I wanted to change the way other people saw it so that they didn't just hit that minimum hurdle of, I've just got my nose over the compliance bar, but they looked at it and said, as an organisation, how could I maximise the value to my organisation of using this lever of inclusive design and capability? So the first thing was that optimistic upside, reaching for the upside as opposed to holding down the downside. The second part was asking and learning. So
Okay.
putting research and insight at the heart of design, as opposed to either old stuff that had been done previously and, oh, when we did this back in 2008 we had this experience, therefore this is what we need to design for. I think I'd done a huge amount of usability testing in the digital space, and that power of people to inform design was absolutely kind of ground into me in that. And the fact that people were changing much faster than we could understand and adapt to, particularly if you're talking about kind of very stable organizations, banking and big retail organizations and so on, where things are quite slow to change. The opportunities, both from a technology perspective, but also people's usage of that, were changing much more rapidly than we could predict, and in different ways to we could predict. So by asking, you can understand what you can't otherwise find. And that's so powerful. So I wanted to bring that power into the front of it. And then the third part was being pragmatic. So rather than doing this and it being this kind of CSR objective or something that kind of you can put on a wall and you can feel good about or whatever, at the end of the day, someone's experience had to change because of the work we did. So someone's life had to be, have less friction, less barriers into it, because we'd done something that had worked better for them. So an actual practical outcome in someone's daily life.
Love it. And I think, if I was putting a client hat on and I was talking to you and, you were trying to explain to me what your drivers were and you were listing through those three things, look, it's not a corporate tick box exercise. There's going to be a really nice reiterative process here, almost taking that lean, agile methodology piece of a product market fit, right? And then we're going to have some pragmatic outcomes here. This would be something as a client, I think you'd naturally gravitate towards. Have you found that's the case with client appetite? Do they see the value that you're trying to present with them?
It's really interesting. Great question, and a challenging answer. The answer is yes and no. So this was a space that there weren't a lot of organisations playing into. As I say, it was a pretty open space when we stepped into it, no pun intended. But we have created a market. We've been successful for 5 years. We have more and more demand for our services. We're about 50% corporate facing, kind of understanding current experiences for current clients in current environments, and about 50% innovation spaces looking to create new things in new ways for new environments. So there is a market there, and we've been able to really move into that and create that and build that around us. Having said that you can't unsee once you've seen this. I still get frustrated by the fact that a lot of people that I engage with, we're still engaging early on in that maturity journey. And I think about UX quite a lot in this, because in the early 2000s, I'm old enough to remember the early stages of digital, when people created digital products, shoved it out there, and then said, people go and learn how to use that. And in the early noughties, UX became this thing. Oh my gosh, you can ask people what they think of it. You can do this iterative design, and then, by mid-noughties, and, you started to get kind of early stage agile, and then lean came in, and then you've got this very iterative process now where most organizations would not imagine creating a digital product particularly, but hopefully any product or service, without engaging with people, without doing it in an iterative and learned way. I'm waiting for the time that inclusive design becomes like that. I'm a little bit frustrated, because I'm an impatient person, that for 5 years of doing this job, we're still having those conversations for the first time with some people, and still helping them open their eyes to the power of inclusive design and edge case insights, and where and how they can be applied to just make much better product and service. I still love sharing that power, but I wish that we were sharing it at the next layer of maturity. And I think we will get there. I think that if you think about just a few weeks ago, it was Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and there were a huge number of events around the world, and organisations like Microsoft and Atos having all-day events that anyone could come into, particularly in this moment with virtual ability to come into them. and learn about the power of inclusive design, both in the workplace and for consumers, and how they could apply it, and lots of very practical, specific sessions that they can do. That wasn't happening 5 years ago. So, there's a lot to be positive about, but yes, I am patiently impatient about let's kind of move further faster.
I can empathise with you for sure on that, but I think that might be another conversation in its entirety. So a couple of things, I guess. The analogy you used earlier was less of the stick, more of the carrot now. So I guess clients that are having these conversations with you, obviously understanding and wants to seize the market opportunity. So can I ask you a little bit about that? What's the size of the market, and what are you trying to help them address on that sense?
Yeah, so the particular communities that we help organisations understand most are people with disabilities, so kind of lived experience of all sorts of disabilities and long-term health conditions. So could be sensory-based, so hearing or sight, mobility or dexterity, or neurodiversity, mental health, and so on, or long-term health conditions. So understanding that kind of ability difference. And the other one is older people, where they may or may not define themselves or identify as disabled, but may have changing functional needs and also be perceived differently by the community, actually for both those communities, which can in itself create barriers rather than just opportunities. So of those two kind of community areas, it's 1 in 5 people have a permanent disability. So this is a huge market for people that could be permanently excluded if you've not actually designed in, for permanent disability. 1 in 3 people will have a disability at any point in time. So we'll have an impairment that might not last more than 12 months, but at the point in time that the ONS has run the survey, that they had something significant that was limiting their day-to-day life. Households that have someone with a disability in them, that's 40% of households in the UK. And yet, as we age, that's going to be 100% of us, because we're all incurring impairments. By the time we're 75, 2 in 3 of us have a long-term disability. So with an ageing society, and actually with wealth moving with age, because the wealthiest parts of our population at the moment are some of the older segments of our population.
Right. Yeah.
This is not just a very large market in terms of numbers of people. This is an enormous opportunity in terms of value of that market, and it's an increasing, it's one of our most rapidly growing communities in society. And it's also one of these things where it's interesting, expectations are changing. Okay. So if you think about from the older community, those that are kind of 85 plus at the moment, their expectation when they got older was very, very different to the expectation that the current baby boomers who are just stepping into retirement or an early retirement now have. They've been fated their whole life. They've been the demographic bubble that everywhere they went, there's been an economic boom around them. So when they hit teenage years, there was a music boom. When they hit young family years, there was a housing boom. When they were having kids, there was a children's toy and services boom. They've hit retirement. So where are the products, the services, and the ways that they wish to engage? And their expectation of healthy aging is quite different to 2 decades ago too. So I think there's a lot of very positive momentum driving inclusive design in a really good direction. I also think people with disabilities have had a similar sort of transformation in that the expectation of being included, there is no reason, particularly as technology and emerging technologies are coming in at such a fast rate. And we've just seen with COVID-19, everyone's working from home. Yes, you can do it in every industry, in pretty well every role. Yes, education can be delivered online. We can never turn that back and say to people again, no, you may not learn from home because we can't manage it. That's gone as an excuse. So there's so many ways in which we can include people with all sorts of different access needs that the expectations are absolutely rightly lifting, and therefore those organisations that are stepping in to fulfil those expectations have open fields at the moment.
Yeah, that's so true, isn't it? A few points on the aspects that you mentioned, with it's a clear problem, right, in terms of what you're trying to address. And what I find interesting when you talk to people about disability who are able-bodied is that they often don't think that they could. I mean, I'm almost 40, and as far as I know, I'm pretty healthy. But at one point in my life, as I get older, as these ailments kick in, I am very likely to suffer from something. It could be disability, so it can happen to anybody in their points in life. So it's in everybody's best interest to take interest in what people like yourself and organizations that like Open are doing to address this. And then to your point about what COVID has done, it sets that precedent now. Having worked in recruitment for such a long period of time, getting an employer to even listen to the conversation to allow individuals to work from home, be it because they've got childcare issues or because they have a disability, it was such a non-starter. If they can't be in the office, it meant that they weren't able to do work. This has completely changed that. And you're right, that opportunity from this problem has now been created. I was interested because the market is so big, and I'm not, as I said, I'm an able-bodied individual, but I have young kids, and I've often found myself and my wife wandering around the city with our kids with a pram. And it's only when you do that and I'm not comparing, I'm very careful not to compare apples with oranges here. It's not like I'm requiring wheelchair access. But I found there's just steps everywhere. And just to navigate with a pram in the city of London is a nightmare, even at stations. The London Bridge has just had a big refurb. But before that, I mean, it's not safe to bring them on escalators and things like that. So, and I know that's not really, you guys, the work that you guys are doing much more, but it's just an analogy about the problems that access can create, from someone who's got able body pushing a pram around.
Actually, I think it is much more than that, in it shows the extended power of universal design. So, sorry, that's not a ghost, that's my dog. So the point is, some people need these facilities to have been designed with their needs in mind all of the time, because they're a permanent wheelchair user and they need that all the time. Some people need it for a period in their life, like a period when their children are young enough that they're having to get around by pram. Some people will need it occasionally because they might be using crutches, or they might be in a wheelchair because they've been injured for a certain period in their in time, or they might be sometime wheelchair users because they have either muscular issues or energy issues. That means that sometimes they can actually get around and walk around themselves. Say someone with multiple sclerosis, and other times they'll be having a dip in their energy or their physical capability and they'll need to be using it. So this isn't a binary, there's those that are in and those that are out. This is a grey shade that some people are always excluded if you haven't taken their needs into account, and some people are occasionally excluded, but pretty well everyone will be excluded at some point in time if basic differences that are just human differences of mobility and sensory needs and cognitive needs aren't taken into account. So in sensory needs, someone wearing sound cancelling headphones walking through a station is the same as someone who's hard of hearing. So if you're thinking about giving emergency messaging to people, you need to think about ways that are not just sound-based to get to both those communities. And that's just a much bigger group of people. If you're thinking about mobility, as you say, you've talked about trams, or you've talked about injuries and so on. And cognitive, someone who's got mild cognitive challenges because of age, or someone who's learns differently and has always done so, or someone who's drunk and coming home from the pub late at night. They all have different ways that they're going to absorb, process, and resolve information. Yeah. So if we're not thinking about that up front, all of those people are excluded. Mm-hmm. So this is just a way to make sure that when we're designing something, it's going to work for more people more of the time. And there is an element of, let's understand those who are most disadvantaged and ensure that significantly unfair disadvantage is removed. But we're all disadvantaged by bad design. Yeah, and that's a really important point.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? And so on that point then, I guess it highlights the importance and the keenness of research, right? And having that understanding. So is that element the key differentiator that Open offers versus maybe perhaps its peers or indeed its competitors?
I think that key of right insight at the right moment. is absolutely a differentiator for us. So we have a community of about just over 500 people at the moment who are either identify as disabled and or over 65.
Okay.
And that gives us this fabulous pool of, humans to respond to various environments or products or services, whether it's paper prototype through to a physical environment. And we've done anything from very, very early stage, say paper prototypes where you're pretending to be a screen reader for a blind person. You can do it for, it can work for everyone, right through to live environments and walkthroughs in really very complex places like airports, where you're getting people going, one side to the other of land side to air side and air side back. So you can do really quite good engagements, and it's the right kind of engagement at the right moment. So it doesn't need to be incredibly expensive 5-stage process. It can be at this moment just 6 people with 6 different needs. They're not going to represent the whole world. They never will. But it's a bit like usability testing, a little bit and as different from each other as possible. And you'll get so much more insight that you can start to work from and start to feed into how you can make something that's going to work better for more people than if you haven't asked that question. So a little bit regularly is always better than kind of either leaving it to the end or not doing it, or even just trying to do it as one big chunk at one moment in time.
So do you, similar to, I guess not that, but I'll ask the question, do you use personas like you would do in a technology design methodology?
We try not to use personas too much because they can end up being too much like a cardboard cutout and not real enough. And the differences between individuals, the thing about a persona is someone's got to create them, which means you've got to imagine a person. So what we try and do is, if we do, it's usually because we've done a piece of design or a piece of research already. Well, then maybe we've had 30 people respond to an environment, and then we might create some amalgamations of those real people into design guidelines, which we can do. So we flip it the other way and say, for a designer, what does that mean for them? So we'll create a set of design guidelines for that. Or we do sometimes do personas that help them understand different groups of people with different preferences and needs, and actually jobs to be done. The jobs to be done perspective on it is also really interesting, because similar communities with similar needs and adaptation approaches, but coming from a slightly different context of what they're coming to that organisation for, and the job that they're trying to get done can make for a very different experience as well. So just going through those various frameworks of what's the person's personal needs, what's the way they adapt to it, what are some of the other contexts around them in their life, their living conditions, whether they live with a family, whether they live alone, whether they have a young family, an old family, whether they go everywhere by car or they prefer public transport, and then the function that they're trying to do, and following through that journey-based approach of their job that they've come to that organisation to do. So we do occasionally, but usually based off a broader, much more real set of people, as opposed to that we're sitting there drawing them up, imagining what this person might be.
Well, why not though? In terms of you utilizing, I guess you would call it a consumer panel of the numbers that you've got with the varieties, because I don't think it can be replaced, right, with actual experience and feelings. So, and so in terms of the work that you would utilize the consumer panel on, what type of work will you undertake?
So we're mainly qualitative. It is a small, it's 500 people, not 20,000. So it's mainly qualitative research, both behavioural and attitudinal. So we'll do anything from surveys, which is very much what people think about things. We'll also do things like ethnographic, in-home studies, obviously not at the moment, though we've just done an in-home diary study where people just did daily videos, but it wasn't us in the home, it was just them doing a daily video and sharing that with us through the COVID period. So we do mystery shopping, where people will actually go on a journey either online or in-store, or a combination of both, to see what that journey feels like for them, and give them specific tasks to be done, and see how that works for them with their access needs and the engagements they have. We work right across the spectrum in terms of environments, as you mentioned before. So we do digital. We also look at customer service and physical environments, and where it's relevant to that, we'll also look at the brand expectations. So what people think about a brand before they even go into those environments.
Right.
So that kind of full spectrum of consumer experience or customer experience is relevant to us, because when you're thinking about how do I get to do something, a customer will come at it in the way that suits them. So if you just do, occasionally we'll just do something just in the digital space or just in the physical space, but we try and come at it from the consumer perspective, which is these days more often than not, multi-channel.
That's excellent. That's brilliant. And I mean, you alluded to it a little bit in terms of what you're trying to do during this period. How has the team and yourself been working during this period? Because obviously,
Really good. Yeah,
needless to say,
really
very
good question.
unusual circumstance, right?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's been challenged by this, us also.
Mm.
Luckily, because of inclusive research, one of the ways we worked very hard to reach demographics into research prior to this period was using remote methodologies. So having someone Skype into a focus group where some people are in there physically in the room, or co-design group. We'd have some people that didn't want to travel, or it was very difficult, or they had anxiety around certain circumstances,
Okay.
would be brought in virtually. And therefore we had habits and we had practices around virtual engagement with our panel, going way back. That has obviously gone to 100% of research at the moment. So all our research is still available. So we still do focus groups, we can do usability testing, we can do mystery shopping, but all of it is being done in a virtual sense. So that's, we've actually even got some physical testing where we're sending a prototype of a new technology around to people to test. And all we're having to do is send it back to our research director each time so it can get fully cleaned off and disinfected and so on between individuals. So even physical testing we've found ways of doing. So yes, if you get creative enough that you can do pretty well everything, it's just using the tools as effectively as we can and making sure those tools are accessible to all the people we're doing the research with.
So good to hear. It's obvious that you've, being who you are and the business that you're trying to be, established that almost from a cultural perspective, right, to not allow physical presence be an inhibitor.
Yes.
Always make it this, which has meant that you've been able to offer your full array of services. So that's interesting. So in terms of market uptake on the other side of the coin, then have you been suffering from some of the downturn that some of the clients might be experiencing? Have they put things on hold, or what are the challenges at this stage?
Yes, absolutely. We're a small business, so like most small businesses at the moment, we're finding it a difficult period to navigate. Having said that, I'm very optimistic long term about what this period will do for insight and design. In fact, I've been using a Napoleon quote recently, which doesn't always go down well in the UK as it does in France. But 200 years ago, he said, in times of great change, it's not foresight or hindsight that we need, but insight. And the more rapid the period of change, the less relevant any knowledge you had from prior to, at any period, because that change is happening so rapidly. Basically, the redundancy of knowledge becomes very fast. So the value of insight goes up. So I think the value we can bring to organisations has only gone up through this period. And also the power of inclusive design has been exposed where it's failed people and organisations, and the opportunity for people to, I think, people's social conscience has been challenged and changed through this period too. This period where we've had more time to reflect in different ways. Obviously what's happening in the US at the moment as well, and thinking about communities that have had very significant racism and bias against them for very long periods of time, and that social unrest that this is kind of given us moment to stop and consider. We don't want to go back to where we were. We want to go forward to something better. And I think a lot of people have that feeling and have this sense of, by shaking everything loose, which a health crisis like this has done, and no, you didn't, we don't want that. It is a health crisis. But the fact that we have everything now loose and everything in this very uncertain state let's put it back together in a better shape than we started from. The stable base we came from is not the place we want to go back to. So short term, it's hard as a small business. And yes, large organizations aren't being able to make decisions to, invest in a whole lot of programs that they might have had on the roadmap, back in January this year. Long term, I think we may have prioritized projects around the sort of work we do over and above other projects that might have been before. So I have a real optimism long term, and yes, we just need to get through the turmoil of now. Having said that, we've been very busy. Some of that busyness is us sharing what we've just done off our own bat. But we've been very lucky. We've had a couple of projects that were going before this period and have kept going through this period. So we haven't quietened down yet. I keep waiting for it, but it hasn't quite happened yet.
I know we were speaking, obviously, just before we clicked the record button, how tired we both were from all the work all day. So I don't doubt that at all. It's interesting, isn't it? Because, had COVID not taken place, obviously, if I'd asked you the question, what challenges Open might be experiencing in terms of the market space, it's a totally different answer now, right? And I find that's really interesting because the perspective of post-COVID, whatever that may or may not look like, how, I'm really eager to understand how, and I'll ask you the question, how leaders would view diversity and inclusion in that space, because working so fragmentedly means that people have to put that extra effort to make inclusion a thing, with everything that's been going on in the media, with all the tragedies that's been happening around the world, the aspect of diversity or prejudice and bias and racism is much more at the forefront. So it's just interesting to see how this all sits together in this melting pot, mixes together, and then what that means for the work that you do, organizations like ourselves at CandidateX, etc., and how that impacts through. So it's just how that's going to navigate out that space, and I'm just interested to see what your thoughts are on that.
I think there's some really interesting pieces to unpick in there. Firstly, for brands, they have both an opportunity and a risk right now, because people are experiencing it in a heightened way, the brand. And this is because if you're at home and if you're trying to get basics for food and the risk of going to a shop, you're choosing not to take that risk and you're not wanting to, and you're excluded because the digital platform that brand offers isn't sufficient for your access needs, or has been overrun by, it's just failed the stress test of this period, or whatever the reasons are. That's going to have a deeper impact on you now because there are fewer things that you're caring more about. So everything's become a little bit more condensed and concentrated. Okay. Therefore, customer experience, either positive or negative, has become more condensed and concentrated, which means if you get it right now, you are going to have an impact in terms of consumer loyalty and consumer positive brand affiliation way more deeply than you would have 6 months ago. If you get things wrong now, the same thing goes. So I suppose firstly is the impact of inclusion or exclusion is higher now. And part of that goes to, we've got fewer things that we're caring more about. And part of it is that the cost of getting it wrong now can be fatal for people. So if people are having to take risks, that means that they're going out and they're putting themselves at risk of getting coronavirus, and particularly those that are more vulnerable to severe impacts from it. The impact of that, and actually either the emotional impact of that, of taking on that risk, or the real impact of that if the risk is realised, is so much more profound that organisations do need to recognise that and do what they can to minimise risks and to maximise the benefits that they can offer to customers on key journeys that are relevant now. Not on everything that they ever did, just on those key things that are relevant now. So I think firstly, that real depth of experience now is very powerful. Use the power for good. If you don't use it for good, and if you don't even notice that it's there, it might be, that you're not succeeding so much in that, and that's not going to be a good thing for any brand right now. Secondly is that there's an ability to change, that things are changing faster and consumers are changing faster. So people that have said they'll never get on digital, or that have said that they will never try whatever it is, Zumba, or we're all doing different things. So this is an opportunity to attract people to an option that you've wanted to provide to them previously. People are far more open-minded about that because so much is new. Because we're all going through so much new, digital transformation has gone through in 3 months what probably 3 years wouldn't have done for us if it wasn't for this period. So using the momentum that is there in a positive way. So there's a number of these things that they're quite profound and they're quite strong, and they can either work with you or work against you depending on how much you're proactively leaning into it and taking advantage of them or not.
It's so, and I love that. It's rather than using the circumstances as a way to box you into a situation where I go, I can't honestly consider diversity and inclusion because I've got all these other priorities, but to actually use the circumstances to help you create, actually, how can I use this in my favor? So not only is it hitting business requirements that I need, but also to create this area here that's much more accessible and to utilize what that consumer movement is now doing, right? That's what you're getting
Well,
at.
let's just take it to your world for a moment and let's think about talent. So if you think as an organisation, we've just been forced to put 100% of our staff into a remote work from home situation, and we've worked out how to do it. Great. Or we're working it out, but we're in that process of very rapidly working out how to enable people to be very efficient and effective from home. You've just opened your doors to a whole talent pool out there that is under-leveraged, which is the talent pool you were talking about before, of people that want to work from home for whatever reason, that actually need to work from home because they're far more efficient in the home environment than they are outside of it, who might wish to work 5 hours a day because they've got care responsibilities, they've got elderly parents that they're looking after, they've got young children they're looking after, or they may themselves have physical needs. That means they're very efficient, but for that period. That ability to not require them to be in an office and to waste that kind of dead time either side on commuting, and to use the live time much more powerfully and much more efficiently for some people. Some people will always be better in the office, and that's going to suit them, and they'll want to put their suit and tie on and go into a shared social environment. Other people, that really takes away from their efficiency. Now, as an organisation, you've created more options. Options, as an economist, I can say, are pretty well always valuable. So if you take it as that, you've created this new funnel to talent that you couldn't even leverage before because you hadn't worked out how to open that door. Now you've opened the door, see what talent's through it.
Excellent, yeah. So on Open and its way it's engaging with clients, if in your mind, I guess on a broader sense, but also very narrow to the client, what does success look like to you when you're engaged with a client? Is it a light bulb moment they might see, or is it, genuine appetite that they want to take on board what you're saying, or what does that look like for you?
Really good question. I think the most powerful impact we can have on an organisation is to make ourselves redundant, that they take that experience they have with us and they go, how did we not see this before? How do we not do this? And they start to actually embed that capability within their organisational wherewithal. So whether it's in terms of skills, whether it's in terms of tools and policies and where they engage, and maybe even creating their own kind of reference group that is the right reference group for their industry and their organisation that has access needs. I love that, funnily enough. I'm not looking for Groundhog Day here. There's so many more organisations out there we haven't got to yet. I would love to retire off as many as we possibly can because they've got this. They've recognised how important it is, and they're building the skills internally to be able to keep that momentum going without us. So to me, that's probably the furthest extent of success. But back within that, it's also little moments like when someone says, oh my gosh, since that change to a product or an environment, and we do testing before and testing after, I can now independently go to that store, do the things I want, independently navigate my way through that environment, or independently manage my own finances. And as a 40-year-old person, I don't need to ask my bloody parents to come in and look at this, to do these bits that I couldn't do before, and to tell me off for the things that they don't think I should be spending. So it's when you enable people to do things independently that they should, they want to be able to do. They've got all the capability to be able to do, but the environment's inhibiting them from that. When we've removed the limitations in the environment and people can do that, and you see those kind of very much one person moments of now I can do that. That's great. It's not the same as changing a whole organization, but it feels great.
But how great is that, though? The overall mission, similar to myself and John and Sunil, when we talk about CandidateX, people ask us, what do you want to achieve? We go, we don't want to exist. Things like us shouldn't have to exist. And that's when we know it's successful. And that's what you're saying. You've helped enable such an open world that you're no longer needed. But before you get to that, it's that individual impact that you've managed to make them feel so independent, and they've taken control, which is brilliant. So what companies in your mind, they don't necessarily have to be clients, do you feel that are leading the way with this and have really done well in terms of accessibility and inclusion?
It's really interesting, and I've thought about this a bit lately. There's some organizations that have got this, and they've got it for the reasons that basically innovation. Real organizations that are working in spaces where innovation has a massive differentiator of success, and let's think particularly about technology organizations for a moment, either physical technology like phone manufacturers or software manufacturers, but where innovation is moving very, very fast, they've worked out the power of extreme insights. And that can be people with permanent disabilities, people that adapt products in very different ways, people that are very, very intense users of a product or very occasional users of a product, people who are very digitally savvy, very new to digital or to a certain experience, even a physical experience, very rare users of a certain physical environment. So once if it's a space where innovation really counts for, success and for long-term potential in that space, those organizations, and you think about Apple and Google and Microsoft, are all working really fast in this space, all have great internal teams. They all know it's a journey. All of them will say that they're not there, and that there's a lot more they can be doing, that they have big footprints, and therefore there's a lot of that footprint that's not yet fully accessible and inclusive.
And that's all right? That's okay to say that. It's brilliant,
Actually, you know what? I think that's a real sign of maturity, because no one ever gets there. I work in an inclusion agency, and let me tell you, we still get things wrong. And, we're constantly looking to try and create environments that are as inclusive as possible. But, we make mistakes. It's a journey. And we also create things that you then go, now test it. We're lucky we have the panel. So our panel leads test our actual research programs. We co-design that with our panel leads, who each represent one of the communities. We have access to that. Not everyone does. So it's a journey. We're all on this journey, and environments are always changing. So we're always having to learn, because we're creating a new product, or we're leveraging a new technology, or we're in a new geography where culturally it's different, or, every time you work in a new way, or work in a new space, or work with a new channel or technology, you've got to learn again. So it's a never-ending journey. But those organizations where innovation is at the heart, they're the ones that we see moving the fastest. The other ones are some of the very highly competitive spaces. So spaces like fashion, spaces like real design spaces, where making things, again, going to the extremes, you can make something that is just more delightful for everyone. And even organizations like Ferrari, creating a Ferrari that is more comfortable to drive in. And they realize that actually a lot of the people that were buying Ferraris are quite a lot older. They're older than the average demographic, because that's when they've got the wealth to go and buy themselves a Ferrari.
Makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, and rather than have these very uncomfortable vehicles that people are spending a fortune on, and then choosing not to drive a lot of kilometres because it wasn't very comfortable, they're actually coming from the inclusion perspective and redesigning that so that it's a more comfortable experience, so that they're getting more value out of their very high-end product. So some of those kind of real, luxury spaces, and Tommy Hilfiger or Nike with their Fly Ease shoe have come from that designing for one, and then bringing that back into making it, the Fly Ease shoe is a shoe where you don't have laces, so it's really easy for someone who's got a mobility challenge to still have a sports shoe and still feel cool about going to school or high school or college or what have you with a shoe that looks like their friends. It's also
Amazing.
Fabulous for lazy teenagers who just can't be bothered doing up their laces. And
Sounds like you've got a few pairs in the house, Christine.
yeah, let's say that they're very practical shoes for those that can't be bothered.
Wonderful. I mean, I have to say, every time I speak to you, and when I get a bit of an overview on this, I feel a lot more positive about what may happen in the future when you hear about, there's some genuine things going on out there that people sort of focused on, but basically by listening to everybody,
Yes.
by taking on board everybody's voice and putting that into account. So just to bring this sort of to a close, I guess a bit more of an open question for yourself. If you could wish for one thing for change or impact around the inclusion space and accessibility in the areas that you work on, what would it be?
My magic wand question, we often use that in our research.
Yeah.
If you gave me a magic wand, I think the one thing I'd love organisations to do is just start learning from the edges. So not even, I use the acronym SWIM, which is someone who isn't me. Even if they just ask two or
I'm going to write that down.
Please do.
I'll just steal that from you.
Yeah. Steal, use, abuse, and share at will, because I think it's a really powerful concept, which is you don't need to take this on as this great big challenge that all of a sudden I'm going to absorb. I'm going to have £100,000 program and we're going to be running this and it's going to be central to our whole strategy. Look at the organisation as it is. Look at what you're creating as it is. And just start asking people who are as far away from your experience or the experience of the designers and the product creators and those that are QAing it and those that are already in that product or environment creation process. Get perspectives from as far away who are relevant customers, who are relevant, and it could be employees as well. It works just as effectively in the employee environment. But to understand how that experience varies from those someones who aren't you. And if you only have one person to ask for someone as different as you. If you've got two, make sure the difference between those two people are as far from each other as polar opposites as possible. And so if you start to build it out, just start by engaging with people with really specific differences and looking for those differences, and then listening and not just taking right, that's their experience, but what can we do with that experience and how can we start to improve what we're putting out there so that it's going to work for them as well.
Excellent.
And the more people just start that journey, that once you start and once you get curious and once you've seen this, we were saying beforehand, you can't unsee it. It's so frustrating. Like, people still don't see it. I can't unsee it. I look at the world through that perspective of how much opportunity there is to make it better.
Brilliant. I think that's a very poignant point to put a stop to where we're at with things. And I think if you could take one takeaway from this entire conversation, it is swim, right? Put yourself into that perspective, those different avenues, and really sort of see the world in that way, so that we can make it more open for everybody that's involved and needs to be. So, Christine, I want to say thank you very much for your time. It's been a brilliant conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you today. It's good to see that you're doing well and you're enjoying everything over in France, and hopefully we'll get to meet in person again soon.
Sounds good, man. It's been an absolute pleasure, and keep safe.
And to you, Christine, thanks to you everyone for listening. I hope you all enjoyed the show. Be good, be kind, and do stay safe.